Okay. I think we'll probably start now. We might have a few extra people coming. Can you all hear me? Is my voice terrible? I think I'm getting ill, so if my voice wavers a bit, it's not my fault. Nothing I could have planned for. I usually give the presentation at the start and then hand it over to the presenter. But because I'm doing both today, I'll keep the first presentation very, very short because I'm afraid I might speak for a while after. So yeah, this is Continental Conversations. We do this event so that at the undergraduate level we can do a tiny bit more post-Kantian philosophy because it isn't really part of our degree. And that's something we don't like, so we're trying to fix that. So far we've had presentations on quite a list. We've had Marcuse, we've had Deleuze, we've had Arendt, we had Said, and we still have yet to do Lacan at the end of term. And we have a few people who are presenting in Trinity. We're still finalizing that, but there might be a few slots open, so if you're interested in presenting in Trinity, please do come forward. Yeah, timing-wise, we don't actually have a room booking, so we can be here as long as we want. I'm aiming to do my presentation in under 30 minutes, but I haven't practiced this yet, and who knows, honestly. I'm really sorry. I'll try to speed it up if it is too long. And if you aren't tired, at the end, we could do a Phil Sock hub trip. Woo!
Sorry, I thought that was the vibe.
Yeah, it's also important to note that PhilSoc is also organizing an event with David Chalmers, and I didn't know that that was happening, but it did bring to mind this one story I heard about Schopenhauer, where he would organize his lectures at the same time as Hegel's out of spite. And of course, this meant that no one would show up to Schopenhauer's lectures. And I don't know who's the Schopenhauer and who's the Hegel in this situation, but we actually got some people showing up today, so I guess that makes us Hegel, but imagine David Chalmers got maybe a bigger turnout. Before I do anything, I want to start with this one quote, which I really like from Nietzsche's, and this is a few days before he, quote unquote, went insane. This is writing to a friend. Between ourselves, it is not impossible that I am the first philosopher of the age. Perhaps even a trifle more than that. Something decisive and fateful standing between two millennia. So that is quite a bold claim, but I think today we'll try to find a way in which that could be true. Okay, a quick biography. He was born in 1844 and died in 1900. His life can be split into 4 sections. From 1444 to the mid-1860s, 1844 to the mid-1860s. This is sort of a religious youth, classical upbringing. He enrolls at the University of Bonn for philology and theology, but drops theology. And at this point in his life, he reads Schopenhauer and he meets Wagner. From 1869 to 1879, he gets the chair of philology at the University of Basel in Germany. And he begins to disassociate from Schopenhauer and from Wagner. From 1879 to 1889 is the most productive period in his life. That's what we find most interesting. But it is also a period of his life in which he is tormented by all sorts of diseases, and sort of had this routine where he would have terrible headaches for 3 days, have a good day, throw up for 3 days straight on an empty stomach, have 2 really good days, and it was sort of this cycle. But we can sort of safely say that whenever he did have a good day, he did right. And that is probably a really bad thing, because he had terrible eyesight, and so sort of writing and reading was really just the death of it. On the 3rd of January, 1889, Nietzsche was in Turin, leaving the hotel that he lived in, and he sees a horse being beaten by a cabman. He runs over to the horse, throws himself around the horse's neck, and collapses. When he wakes up, he's in his hotel room, and he never refers to himself again as Nietzsche, and instead he calls himself Dionysus or the Crucified. So from 1889 to his death in 1900, he is insane and in the tutelage of his mother and sister, and there's nothing of note except sort of an overgrown mustache. Okay, sort of initial preamble before I speak about the topic at hand. Nietzsche is a particularly difficult thinker to present on, and that's not to say that the past thinkers we've spoken about aren't difficult or that they don't require subtlety. But he's difficult because Nietzsche seems purposefully to refuse to allow himself to be expressed in words other than his own. And even his own words seem to betray him at times. But we can turn this into an advantage in some ways. We can embrace Nietzsche's own reveling in ambiguity and overgeneralization. And maybe if we do so, we could catch glimpses of those insights which refuse precision and logical consistency. When I decided to present on Nietzsche, the first thing I wanted to talk about was a painting by the surrealist painter René Magritte. This painting is "This is not a pipe." I'm not going to do the French pronunciation of that. And I really want to say, this is not Nietzsche, and that we're not aiming for Nietzsche. Instead, we're embarking on a process of representation, of reproduction, and of allegory, and different rules apply. I think Magritte said that the pipe wasn't supposed to be good at smoking tobacco. Like, it just, there's different things, there's a different sort of realm of qualification. There's two ways we could go about the presentation that I'm doing, and they're both a bit enticing. The first would be to try to, in 25 or 30 minutes, present Nietzsche's philosophy. And I mean that sort of Nietzsche's philosophy tout court, or whatever. That could maybe not be the best option. The second option would be do one limited idea and really try to do it well. Let's think about the first approach for a few moments. So Schopenhauer, in the preface to his big book, The World as Will and Representation, says that his philosophy is one thought. And the quickest and the most efficient way he could express that is by writing this book, which is 300 and whatever pages. It's a difficult, annoying book. Heidegger, who's known to be a great interpreter of Nietzsche, but also a very unique interpreter of Nietzsche, in 1937 extrapolates from this idea of one thoughtness and says that each thinker thinks one single thought. For Heidegger, Nietzsche was indeed a thinker, and he did have one thought, but that one thought was both the will to power and the eternal reoccurrence of the same. Now, if that's his one thought, and if we do have 25 minutes and that clock has already started ticking, how do we breach this one single thought? It would be as if I were to write on a piece of paper or something the name will to power and eternal reoccurrence, and then stop writing, stop speaking, and say, let's discuss. That seems like it could be a bit of a futile thing, and that we could all have very, very idiosyncratic conversations. We would each bring our own notion of will to power and of eternal reoccurrence to the table. Are there any solutions to this? Well, the unreachability of Nietzsche's philosophy was something that he was very, very aware of. In 1886, after writing and publishing Beyond Good and Evil, this book also failed to sell. It failed to sell terribly. This is someone who isn't particularly wealthy and who would like his books to be sold for various reasons. And because of it, he decides to write on the Genealogy of Morals in 1887. And this is a collection of 3 essays, which is Nietzsche at his most sort of inviting. He's most friendly. He's really there to give you a helping hand so you can understand his philosophy. Could the Genealogy of Morals be our invitation into his one single thought? Maybe. But if that is the case, it seems that we've gone full circle. We just started off by discussing that first approach to his philosophy, which is looking at his overall philosophy. And in doing so, now we're speaking about one particular idea that we want to do well. So it seems like we might have gone full circle. Nietzsche writes in aphorisms. His books are a collection of aphorisms. And if you read Nietzsche, initially it seems like these aphorisms have no apparent order. It can be quite frustrating. But the more you read Nietzsche, the more these aphorisms feel thematically coherent and united. Like the Impressionist Monet, who would paint the same landscape at different times of day to begin to feel that each aphorism is an arrow shot by Nietzsche from a different vantage point at the same target. In other words, the more you read Nietzsche, the more you feel the many thoughts becoming one single thought. We can maybe borrow the Three Musketeers motto here, one for all and all for one. So on the Genealogy of Morals, 1887 is a collection of essays. These are still aphorisms, but they're the most polite aphorisms. They're Nietzsche's most rigorous attempt not to write in aphorisms. They're longer, they appear more like essays, and the second tends to follow on from the first. If we treat each essay like a bloated aphorism, which might not be a senseless thing to do because the third essay is a very long explanation of a particular aphorism of Nietzsche's, but which aphorism we don't know yet, if I remember correctly. But if we treat one of these essays like a bloated aphorism, we could maybe get a glimpse of this greater one single thought. So we'll be focusing on the first essay on the Genealogy of Morals, which is good and evil, good and bad. This essay describes how these two pairs of concepts come to be. The confines of this approach are clear. We're in some senses sort of swimming in puddles next to the sea. But if we cling to the motto, one for all and all for one, we can maybe catch a glimpse of Nietzsche's one single thought. So let's swim. Nietzsche considered the good philosopher to be the thinker that asks new questions. This is opposed to coming up with new answers to old questions. This can be seen in his approach to morality. Instead of answering the question, what is the good, he asks the new question, how does the concept of the good come to be in the first place? The question, what is the value of morality itself, reveals an assumption found within the prior questions asked by moral philosophers. When the utilitarian asks, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for an action to be good, they are assuming that the good exists and that their job is to find those things which are indeed good. When Nietzsche asks instead, what is the value of truth, he is asking a very, very different question to what things are true. For Nietzsche, the questions asked by philosophers depend on the concrete problems of the historical moment that they live in. So if we think, for example, of Plato and Kant, they're both philosophers, but they're doing very, very different things. Plato is in some ways dealing with sophistry and with the political turmoil of his historical moment, when Kant instead is dealing with trying to fuse together a strong, rigorous sense of Christian morality with the advances that are happening in the natural sciences. They're doing very different things, but they're both called philosophers. Nietzsche himself exists in a particular historical moment and is dealing with the problems that for him plagued that historical moment. For him, the 19th century contains a unique set of problems. These can sort of be split into three, but they're actually one thing, and we can unpack that if we want later. There is the threat of decadence, the threat of nihilism, and the threat of the loss of vitality. And it is from this context that Nietzsche philosophizes and asks new questions. Let's go to that question, which we see as being quite new. Under what conditions can a society gain and subsequently lose vitality or meaning? Okay, well, to actually explore that question, we should probably come up with some sort of definition for vitality. Vitality is probably some sort of self-affirmation, self-expression, self-continuation, and it is sometimes biological health in Nietzsche and sometimes cultural health. In The Antichrist, great title, 1888, vitality is described as the feeling that power is growing and that resistance is being overcome. That can sound quite evil. Like, if that's vitality, I'm not sure I want to have that. Well, why would I want to be here sort of constantly overcoming resistance to be vital? But he means this in a very, very loose sense. His notion of vitality can apply to the creation of art, of music, and even to dancing and jumping. To which, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where great emphasis is placed on vitality, you turn any page and he's really just saying jump and dance. It just happens. Go on a run, jump, dance. That happens every few pages in that book. Self-affirmation, which we've just used as a definition in turn of vitality, which is a component of it, but sometimes simply a psychological attitude for Nietzsche, is experiencing your own life as good and experiencing yourself as good. For Nietzsche, as opposed to other thinkers, self-affirmation is inherently a differential act. X is good as compared to Y. To be the sort of person who likes jeans, for example, it means that you're the sort of person who likes jeans instead of cargo shorts. In other words, to like jeans, there must be cargo shorts to not like or to like less. Valuation is always a preference, and you prefer X to some Y. Self-affirmation, and to a greater extent vitality, as a structure of preference, requires a so-called pathos of distance in society to appear. This is in some sense a hierarchical structure, but it really means to have in society the sort of difference that allows you to affirm yourself by negating a different sort of existence. Your self-affirmation implicitly denominates other ways of life as lesser. To also understand these questions that we're asking, we should probably provide a definition of morality for Nietzsche. Let's return to that question. Under what conditions can a society gain and subsequently lose vitality or meaning? Nietzsche sees morality as the motor or the catalyst which can explain this gaining and then this loss of vitality and meaning. This is a very distinct notion of morality. I find myself saying that a lot when I speak about Nietzsche. It is common to think of morality as a unified, coherent set of values, especially in a particular historical moment or society. So, intuitively, we might want to feel that the institution of Christian morality sent us naughty or niceless, and our judicial systems to have, in a certain respect, the same idea of what is good and the same idea of what is bad. Within the history of philosophy, we can see a similar sort of assumption on behalf of Hegel, who thinks that a particular historical moment has some sort of internal logic. For Nietzsche, this isn't exactly true. The morality of a given historical moment is a set of distinct and often antithetical values. I cite here from Beyond Good and Evil. As in the realm of the stars, it is sometimes two suns which determine the course of a planet. As in certain cases, suns of differing colors shine on a single planet, now with the red light, now with the green light, and sometimes striking it at the same time and flooding with many colors, so we modern men are, thanks to the complicated mechanism of our starry firmament. Determined by differing moralities, our actions shine alternately in differing colors. They are seldom unequivocal, and these are cases enough in which we perform many-colored acts.
And just like that, the camera stopped recording. The best laid plans. A year later, and finally uploading these lectures to YouTube, we decided to film the second half of this lecture, both as an excuse to go over the material once more and for the satisfaction of seeing a project through to its end. Now, to return to that citation. A given value or set of values can be more dominant than another value or set of values. To use Nietzsche's poetic language, a certain sun can, in a particular historical moment, shine more brightly. But it is important to emphasize for Nietzsche that a society's morality is still a mosaic. Let's consider an implication of this claim. If morality is a mosaic, then there can't be one unitary good or bad. In the same way we are prone to think of the morality of a certain historical moment as coherent, we are also prone to think that the use of the term good in a certain historical moment is coherent. Nietzsche is rejecting both claims of coherence here. A further implication of this, and reminding ourselves of the previous discussion of affirmation, affirming always involves a denying. Again, jeans and cargo shorts. The affirmation good is opposed to bad. Now, if the concept were unitary, it would be opposed to one unitary opposite. Yet, if the concept of good isn't unitary, if there is more than one good, then it can't be opposed to one unitary bad. And a weird, unusual ally for this claim by Nietzsche is Aristotle, who in the 5th book of the Nicomachean Ethics writes, as a general rule, if one of a pair of contraries is said in more than one way, it follows that the other is too. Now, the two pairs of contraries which Nietzsche introduces are good and bad on the one hand, and good and evil on the other. The first pair will be called master morality, and the second slave morality. Now, before diving into these two sets of moralities, it is important to give a qualification of a term often associated to Nietzsche's treatment of both. This is the term myth. When we say myth in philosophy, we can think of the prime example of Plato's myth of and in treating Nietzsche's use of myth, it's helpful to contextualize what it means, because in common usage it can mean a story which is fantastical and probably not true. But from what I understand, Nietzsche uses myth to locate a type of explanation which is in between two extremes. It is not something to be localized in a particular sequence of historical events, but it is equally not an abstract structure devoid of historical ties. So Nietzsche's myth of master morality and myth of slave morality is to be located somewhere in between an exact sequence of historical events and an abstract structure with no relation to history. It is up to us to decide to what extent it falls in the middle. To begin with master morality, also known as noble morality. This myth begins with one group of a community oppressing another group of a community. Now, later on in Nietzsche's essays on the genealogy, there's a third group, but we can really ignore that for now. So the power relation between the oppressing group and the oppressed group is hegemonic, and it is perpetuated throughout the generations. The first group are the masters, and the second are the slaves. The masters construct a narrative in which they are good. To cite from the second aphorism of the first essay on genealogy, the master's right of naming extends so far that it is permissible to look upon language itself as the expression of the power of the masters. Nietzsche writes that the masters have naming rights. So the term good would be used by the master class to both describe their own way of life and affirm their own way of life. We could say that it is used self-descriptively and self-affirmingly. It is presenting and endorsing their way of life, which comes about due to their power, due to a feeling of superiority. Now, Nietzsche has some evidence for this, which is unusual evidence, but because he was a philologist, it comes natural to him to turn to language and the history of language to back up these claims. So Nietzsche has it that in many current European languages, the term good derives etymologically from terms like aristocratic and noble. As was discussed earlier, self-affirmation is a differential act. To affirm something else is always negated. So what happens when the master sees or describes the life of the slave, a life which is systematically different? For Nietzsche, the master would describe it as bad. Now, this isn't bad in the sense of moralizing. We should maybe think of good and bad as first and second rank. The word bad is secondarily given to those who don't instantiate the characteristics associated to the word good by the master class. And again, there's philological evidence for this. Bad is etymologically connected with vulgar and plebeian. So the master self-affirms, and in the light of that affirmation, the slave life is bad. And this again connects with the notion of the pathos of distance. This bad should not be confused with evil. There's nothing morally reprehensible in the life of the slave. For the master, the lion is not angry at the buffalo for being a buffalo. The lion just wouldn't want to be a buffalo. Now to turn to slave morality, also known as herd morality. We said that the master has naming rights. What does this mean for the slave? Well, that means that at their disposal, the language that they have to come to terms with reality is that of the masters. That, though, does mean that the language they use to describe themselves reinforces the fact that they got the short end of the stick. It reinforces the fact that they are suffering, but without giving a meaning to their suffering. And this, for Nietzsche, is a highly uncomfortable state for us to be in. We want our suffering to have meaning for Nietzsche. So this leads to a very, very important part of the story, which is the slave revolt in morality. This begins with a feeling of resentment. I cite here from the 13th aphorism from the first essay on genealogy. It is not surprising that the lamb should bear a grudge against the great birds of prey. Now I cite again from the 10th aphorism. The slave's revolt in morality begins with resentment itself with itself becoming creative and gives birth to values. A resentment experienced by those who, deprived as they are of the proper outlet of action, are forced to obtain their satisfaction in imaginary acts of vengeance. Later on in that same aphorism, the slave's action is fundamentally a reaction. The contrary is the case when we come to the aristocrat system of values. It acts and grows spontaneously, and merely seeks its antithesis in order to utter a more grateful and exultant yes to its own self. This revolt in morality involves, through imagination, separating the actions described as good by their masters from the evaluative endorsement of good, and changing the quality of this endorsement. To express the new evaluation of the same set of actions previously called good by the masters, the slaves use the term evil. Hence, those ways of being of the powerful are, in the light of a different sun, to recall that previous citation, evil. Now, this is the moment in which the slave creates, and it is done through imagination and fueled by resentment. By negating the master's actions, they are indirectly affirming their own. We can think of pity, sympathy, kindness and humility, equality even, now becoming good. This is the so-called transvaluation of values, and this isn't just a switching around because bad and evil are different. To explain why bad and evil are different, I will speak about grammar and its metaphysical implications. This is the second part of Nietzsche's discussion of slave morality, and it is very inventive and can be used outside of the context of the genealogy, in conversations in Anglophone philosophy this day, conversations on personal identity, conversations on free will, and it's a very, very insightful piece of philosophy. Okay, let's start with the sentence, Mary drinks warm milk. The subject, Mary, has the predicate of drinking warm milk. Let's think about this structure of subject and predicate. For Nietzsche, it can have metaphysical significance embedded into it. It isn't a dry, objective, grammatical structure. The subject is treated as a continuing subject, which can be predicated in different ways. While we say that Mary drinks warm milk, Mary could very well drink tea. For Nietzsche, this division between subject and predicate separates the subject from the predicate, turning the subject into some sort of Barbie, which you can dress or predicate to your heart's content without the Barbie changing. The subject begins to exist independently of any particular predication. For Nietzsche, this is a quote-unquote fundamental fallacy embedded into and reinforced by grammar. I cite here from the 13th aphorism of the first essay on genealogy. Just as people distinguish between lightning and its flash, and interpret the latter as the action which is performed by a subject which is called lightning, so also does popular morality distinguish strength from the expression of strength, as though behind the strong man there existed some indifferent neutral substratum which enjoyed the freedom to express strength or not. Now, evidence for this, evidence for the fact that our grammar can shape reality as opposed to being shaped by reality are sentences like "it rains" or "it thunders," where clearly our grammar is imposing a certain arbitrary conceptual organization to the world around us. For the very fact that what is it that rains? What is the it that rains? Now Mary, according to Nietzsche, becomes more than someone who drinks warm milk. Because Mary is different from drinking milk, Mary decides to drink milk. Now this is something similar to the property of free will. For Nietzsche, because of this separation between subject and predicate, Mary could not drink milk if she wanted to. The final component is metaphysical responsibility. As a subject which is in no way reducible to any predication, I am responsible for how I predicate myself. Now, we might want to step back and say that this metaphysical imposition onto grammar is just. We might want to say that that is just how things are. But for Nietzsche, free will and responsibility are an invention irrevocably tied to power structures. Instead of the normal picture, where moral philosophy is an application of a philosopher's metaphysics, for Nietzsche, morality is the reason for turning to metaphysics in the first place, as a way of justifying a certain set of moral claims. Epistemology, metaphysics, and ontology would be a defense mechanism for sustaining a certain morality. And again, we can maybe think of Kant here. So the conceptual apparatus built into our grammar is then connected with the notion of evil. This conceptual apparatus allows for the articulation of the previously unarticulated rejection of the life of the master. The master is now morally responsible for having acted in the manner that they did. This also begins to be applied to the life of the slave. The slave now chooses to be humble or to be a pacifist. They can now reinterpret their state of oppression as a virtue, which depends on a choice. The slave chooses their life and not to be rewarded for it, and the master chooses their life and not to be punished for it. Of course, suffering now has meaning. This eventually culminates for Nietzsche in different ways in Christian morality, in Buddhism, and in Schopenhauer's philosophy. And in Nietzsche's language, this highest form of slave morality, which can be seen throughout Western history, is life denial or world denial. How does this all come together? For Nietzsche, the history of the West is the struggle between these two moralities and these two notions of good. I cite here from Beyond Good and Evil. In all higher and mixed civilizations, there are also attempts at the reconciliation of the two moralities, but one finds still oftener the confusion and mutual misunderstanding of them. Indeed, sometimes their close juxtaposition, even in the same man, within the same soul. I go here to an example from Crime and Punishment, where the protagonist, Rodion Raskolnikov, is a young academic who feels he is on the verge of advancing in philosophy. Yet his family is poor, and his sister is at risk of marrying an unkind man so as to fund Raskolnikov's work. To keep this from happening, he robs an old woman who is a creditor. He ends up killing her, and in the following months descends into madness. On the one hand, he feels justified. On the other, he feels evil, disgusting, and subhuman. This torment results in him confessing and going to prison. Now, I don't have very much more time, and I want to stop presenting Nietzsche's theory and turn to interpreting it and thinking about different ways in which we could leave today. I want to point out maybe a simple version of Nietzsche's genealogy and its conclusions, and a nuanced version, and advocate for the second. So it might emerge from what I've said that there is this binary division in Nietzsche's presentation. On the one hand, there is master morality, which is positive, affirmative, creative, and powerful. And on the other side of a very sharp division, there is slave morality, which is negative, negating, reactive, and weak. One reason for maybe thinking that the story is slightly more complex and nuanced is the fact that the slaves show a blatant instance of creativity. They are the creative force in the essential event in Western morality for Nietzsche. Slave morality won with Christianity becoming the religion of Europe. More broadly, it is commonly assumed that Nietzsche himself is, in one way or another, predicating master morality as good and slave morality as bad. In particular, in 20th century Anglophone interpreters, Nietzsche was seen as trying to affirm his own life through his philosophy as a way of coping with his ills. And this always comes with this great pleasure in reminding the reader that Nietzsche wouldn't be a master, just think about his health. And there's a few reasons to think that it actually isn't so simple for Nietzsche, that he isn't endorsing master morality wholeheartedly and rejecting slave morality wholeheartedly. One reason, which is a personal one for me, is his collapse in 1889, which is a collapse which can't be understood if not through the language of empathy, pity, and compassion. Further, Nietzsche also thinks that philosophy comes about due to the slave revolt. The revolt is what makes life interesting, and indeed is what makes us human. The masters are dull, impulsive, and unthinking. They cannot be Nietzsche's hero. There's also a sense in which he wishes for these two moralities to exist contemporarily, in highest possible tension, to produce great individuals. There's also a sense in which he wants to bring about a new historical era in which these two moralities have been overcome. But Nietzsche's exact stance on his own genealogy is still very much up for interpretation. Before ending, I want to explore possible impacts and maybe sources of reflection of Nietzsche's genealogy. One way of doing this is considering post-Kantian philosophy before Nietzsche and after Nietzsche. One big difference is that the field of ethics becomes far less prominent. Instead of ethics, after Nietzsche, we find genealogies and theories of authenticity and inauthenticity, where authenticity would be a certain correct relationship to one's history and historical constitution. Ethics seems to be slightly abandoned almost, perhaps because it is seen as tied to power structures, irrevocably so. Questions like what actions are good seem to disappear and are replaced by other questions, like who benefits from this particular definition of goodness, who does morality serve, How should I live if knowledge is at the behest of power? An example of influence by Nietzsche is Deleuze's new approach in philosophy, which he finds in Nietzsche, where philosophy is supposed to ask new questions, interesting questions, as opposed to giving answers to old questions. And it's only right to end this presentation by encouraging us to ask new questions of our own. To put us in the right mood, I will start by listing a few of the questions Nietzsche felt he was the first to ask in the history of Western philosophy. What are the values of our values? What is the value of all previous evaluations? What is the value of morality? And what is the value of truth? If you're interested in pursuing these topics further, I recommend Raymond Geiss's lecture series on Nietzsche's genealogy, which were invaluable sources of consultation in my own preparation for this lecture. Thank you for listening.